Welcome to Cepher Commentaries. Today we pick up our discussion with Genesis or Bere'shiyth, chapter 10. Now these are the generations of the son of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. And to them were born sons after the flood. The sons of Japhet, Gemer, Magog, and Madai, and Yavan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Thrace. And the sons of Gemer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarma. And the sons of Yavan, Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and the Dodanim. By these were the isles of the other nations, divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, and after their families in their nations. And the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mitzrayim, and Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seva, and Havilah, and Savta, and Ra'amah, and Savteka. And the sons of Ra'amah, Sheva, and Dedan. And Cush fathered Nimrod, and he began to be a warrior and a hunter in the earth. So we have a very interesting lineage that's given here. You would think that given that Shem was the firstborn, that the lineage would be delineated here, talking about Shem in the first instant, but it does not. Instead, it's going to elaborate on the children of Ham, and in particular, the children of Cush and Canaan. And it's quite interesting that we see Nimrod spring from the line of Cush. So going back, again, you might have read this as Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But of course, that ignores the chet at the beginning of the word Ham. So it's Shem, Ham, and Japhet. There was no J in the language, so the name is Japhet. And when we see the sons of Japhet, we begin with Gemer. Well, Gemer is a very interesting word because it infers a stranger, not Gomer, but Gemer. And this is something, again, when we transliterate, we find that there is a substantial difference in what we find, because once you transliterate, you're no longer dealing with just a name that has really no meaning. You're dealing with names that have a lot to be said about the names. Now, for instance, so we see in Gemer, this is the name of a son of Japhet and also of a Hebrews, okay? But it comes from the word gamar in the sense of to end, to cease, to come to an end, to fail, to perfect, to perform. Gemer. The spelling is Gimel, Mem, Resh. Not the O is invented by the Masoretes in Gomer. So we see also the sons of Gemer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarma, or Togarma. Now, this is going to bring up some interesting questions as to the location of these sons, because you're going to see that land is going to be divided, and when it's divided, the northern side of the landmass, or what is also referred to as, is going to be the situs of the house of Japhet, and Gemer and his son Ashkenaz are later going to be claimed to have taken the area that we call Central Europe, that is to say Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, even Austria, in that area, Central Europe, and that this was the home of Ashkenaz. Well, we'll talk about that when we get to it, because there's some interesting discussion in the book of Yashar about where these tribes are located. And we're going to see that Jasher tells us that they were primarily located along the great rivers of Europe. That would be the Danube, the Rhone, the Rhine, the Oder, and some of the rivers in Italy, including the Arno and some of the others in the north. All right, so let's get back into talking about these sons of Ham: Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Oftentimes the Bible commentators do not distinguish or give you the name Mitzrayim. They instead give you Egypt. And in fact, let us see here and see what we were given in the KJV in verse 6. We were given, and the sons of Ham, not Ham, Cush and Mitzrayim, and Put and Canaan. Okay, so we're not going to get a description of Egypt. Quite often, the script replaces Mitzrayim and the Mitzrayim for Egyptians, both from the upper and lower Nile. And of course, Put is oftentimes translated as Libyans, and Cush, in fact, the Strong's Concordance says, well, Cush that's the name of Ethiopia. That's interesting, because when we look now at Ethiopia, and of course we say Ethiopia, actually the Ethiopians say Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was a name that at one time was used to describe all of sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, there are maps showing the South Atlantic Ocean as the Ethiopian Sea, or the Ethiopian Ocean. We have the Atlantic in the north and the Ethiopian in the south. The Atlantic, of course, would be named after Atlantis, where we also see evidence of the Atlas Mountains, lending credence to the idea that that ocean, the water that came up alongside that, was called the Atlantic, whereas the bottom half, or the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean, at least as we refer to it today, was known as the Ethiopian Ocean. So Ethiopia was a generous term that was used to describe virtually all of southern Africa. Again, when we get into this more, we're going to see that there's going to be a breakup of the land in specific territories, and it's going to delineate Cush at the far east, Mitzrayim along the river, Put to the west of them, and Canaan to the west of them. But of course, Canaan would transgress and leave his turf. Okay, and Cush fathered Nimrod, and he began to be a warrior and a hunter in the earth. Now, this term warrior and the hunter is, again, we see this reference to Gibberim, and Gibberim were described in Genesis 6:4 as being the progeny of the Beni Elohim and their transgression with humankind. And in fact, the word used to describe Nimrod is Gibberim. Okay, and so that infers, if you will, that there was a seed line in Nimrod that was consistent with the Beni Elohim. Now, if that's the case, then we see that the seed line existed also in Cush, which means that the seed line may have also been found in Ham. Either way, we can see that there are certain triggers that cause the Gibberim to re-emerge on the earth. Now, Nimrod himself is an interesting character because we don't find much of a record of Nimrod using that name. And there's a number of reasons why we may not have seen Nimrod used in that way, because Nimrod may be, again, a compilation of prefixes which substantiate or which create the prefixes which create a different meaning of the name. Like, for instance, give you an example. When we look at the name Nebuchadnezzar, we can see several things in that name, that the god he worshipped was called Nebu, and the status of king was Netzar. So Nebu was his god, Netzar was his status, and his real name was simply Chad. But when we get into the Hebrew, we're going to see it's a little bit more complex than that, because we're going to see this these prefixes, Nun and Mem, occupying the spot of prefixes. And then we can see that the true root of the word here may be this idea of Rud, that is to say, Resh Vav Dalet, Resh Vav Dalet. And so this is why we may not see the name Nimrod in history, because it may be that it was describing somebody entirely different, and that we have these prefixes saying, we shall be from Rud, which is what the Nun and the Mem would be. We shall be from the land of Rud. I find that kind of interesting, and I haven't thought of that before, but I can tell you that this would be kind of common when we talk about rightly dividing the word, because again, there is nothing in the record to substantiate this name. So Nimrod is going to be not a name, but rather a descriptive. We shall be from the land of Rud, or we shall be from Rud, R-U-D. The Masoretes will try to tell you it's R-O-D, but there's a very strong possibility that there was no O in the ancient Hebrew at all. The vowel didn't exist. Okay, let me see. I'm just going to check here and see if we can find anything on this idea of Rud and what this land may have been. Because again, we can see that in looking at these things, it's going to be very, very difficult to find the geography that is consistent with this period of time, because, of course, the earth may have changed. In fact, there was a very good discussion about this recently on Telegram, talking about the fact that there may have been a pole shift, a partial pole shift, but there has most certainly been radical geographic changes since the time that these events took place. We can see, for instance, that there is cities off the coast of India that are underwater, off the coast of Egypt that are underwater, off the coast of Japan that are underwater. We can see a great deal of this. We can also see that there is, at one point, I mentioned this before, that we had Doggerland. We had Doggerland in off the coast of Britain. And so because of this, we can see that that Doggerland was evidence of, in fact, that the oceans were substantially lower in places at one period of time historically. So this is why, and another reason we can't river across Western Africa that's gone, and the Kuwait River running across Saudi Arabia is another river that the bed is present, but the river is gone. Now, the word Rud is a primitive root. This is Resh Vav Dalet, and it means to tramp about, to ramble, to be free, or descalanza, to have dominion, to be lord, to mourn, or to rule. So you can see, I shall be, right? When we talk about the Nimrod, it's we shall be from those who trample about. So Nimrod, again, is an expression that talks about who he is, not necessarily what his name is. Now, it brings other questions to mind if those other names have that kind of an issue. One name we see here is the name Havilah. Now, Havilah is also an interesting name because this is a person who is going to be describing a territory that is going to be delivered of a river. And we're going to see that this becomes kind of important when we're considering the text, because the river is one of those four rivers described in Genesis 2. And so this becomes extremely important because this is where Havilah was. And Havilah, it is told to us, also, so let me see if I can find this first, and I'll share it with you here just 1 second. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so it says here that the names of the rivers in Genesis 2, beginning in verse 10, and I'm river went out from Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 heads. The name of the first is Pidgeon, and it encompasses the land of Havilah, where there is gold. So this is quite interesting. We're talking about the Pidgeon River going into the land of Havilah. Well, one begs the question, how did it get named Havilah before Havilah was born? Generations before Havilah was born. Well, this is a translation anomaly that people should understand, that when a translator is dealing with a text, when you have an idea that you're going to identify something, a landmass, you're going to use a common word that is understandable to replace a word that is not understandable. And so in this particular case, Havilah is the land of the Pidgeon River. And the name of the second river is, of course, hold on. Sorry. Maybe I'll just skip the name of the. Okay, it's the River Gihon, and the River Gihon encompasses at the whole land of Cush. And again, Cush was not yet born. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. It wanders toward the east of Ashur. And the fourth river is Parath. Okay, and so these are some important things. And knowing Havilah and Cush and these names, we can see that this becomes critically important for our understanding of where they go. And what they do is going to reflect on the geography that will later tell us where the Holy Land may possibly be. Okay, and in the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom, this is in verse 10 of chapter 10, was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. All right, now, when we talk about Babel, this means that this town had already been created at the point that Nimrod goes to visit this place. So that is a very interesting situation because you're only 3 generations in, and yet he is creating 4 cities here. And these cities all have equal importance. We might recall that the Akkadians are going to come out of this city called Akkad. The Babylonians are going to come out of this city called Babel. Although when we get to Babylon itself, the beautiful Babylon, this is the creation of the Kasdim. In fact, it's called the excellence of the Kasdim. This is when the political power would shift from Ashur to Babel. Okay, and Calneh also is extremely important in this equation. Out of that land went forth Ashur and built Nineveh and the city Rehovot and Kilach. And Resen, between Nineveh and Kilach, the same as a great city. And Mitzrayim fathered the Ludim, and the Anamim, and the Lehabim, and the Naphtuchim, and the Pathrusim, and the Kalkukim, out of who came the Pelishtim, and the Kaftorim. So we can see that the Pelishtim are not a mysterious group of people. They were from Mitzrayim. All right, now, and Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Chet. Now, Chet is an interesting fellow because he went on to expand his name to 7 heads, and it was just merely pronounced Chet. And the Yebusi, and the Emori, and the Girgashi, and the Chivi, and the Arki, and the Sini, and the Arvadi, and the Tzipmari, and the Chemathi, and afterward were the families of Canaim spread abroad. So we can see that Canaan is going to father a large tribe of people, a large group of tribes. And the border of the Canaanim was from Sidon as you come to Gerar, to Atzah as you go to Sodom and Amorah, and Admah and Sevaim even to Lasha. Now, this is going to be very interesting, again, trying to describe and trying to understand the whole of the land of Canaan. These are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and and again, very important to see that this is demonstrating, again, the beginning of, when we look at these genealogies, you want to remember that this is creating tribes. This is creating tribes. So we talk about in their tongues, the word there is lashon. In their countries, the word there is eretz. So it might be better to say in their territories, in their tongues, in their territories, and in goyi, in the plural. Just a moment. Yeah, it is in the plural. It's goyim. And so when you see this, you can see that later this is going to be more specified when the land is divided during the time of Peleg. Okay, to Shem also, the father of the children of Ebru, the brother of Japhet the elder, even to him were children born. The children of Shem, Elam, and Ashur, and Arath Kased, and Lud, and Aram. And the children of Aram, Uts, and Chul, and Gether, and Mash. And Arath Kased fathered Shelach, and Shelach fathered Ebru. And to Ebru were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Yoktan. And Yoktan fathered Almodad, and Sheleph, and Chatzar Mavet, and Yerak, and Hadaram, and Utzal, and Dikra, and Oval, and Abimael, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Yovav. All these were the sons of Yoktan. Now, again, the land of Ophir, the land of Havilah is called a land of gold, where the gold is good. The land of Ophir was known for its gold, the gold of Ophir. And their dwelling was from Mesha as you go to Sephar, a mountain of the east. These are the sons of Shem after their families, after their tongues, and after their lands, and after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided on the earth after the flood. And now, again, we're talking about the Toldot here. We're talking about the generations. We're talking about the genetics of Noah and his sons. And these gene pools then are going to be discrete. They're going to be divided, and they're going to be traceable. And we're in the process right now. There's many a strong geneticist, including Dr. Jeanson, who has been working at looking through these genetic lines to distinguish the various haplogroups that can be identified with these tribal migrations. And again, without mutation, the Y DNA goes back all the way to Adam. So the question on these haplogroups becomes very, very important in what we see. Now, of course, when we talk about this idea of these sons of Shem, let's remember that the modern understanding is that Elam is going to be in Persia. Elam, the land of Elam, is along the Persian Gulf, on the eastern side of the Persian Gulf. Ashur is a question. There is evidence now kind of arising that Ashur may have been located on the eastern banks of the Red Sea in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Arath Kased, it is believed, was in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, and Lud was much more up into the Anatolian Peninsula, and Aram occupied the area that we call Syria today. That's the general understanding. Now, I'm not saying that we can determine that from this, and I'm not even certain that it's determinable at all, and that even that is accurate. But it's important to recognize that this is the generally accepted disposition of these tribes. Now, verse 24 here says, Arath Kased, and you might remember his pronunciation is Arpakshad, But that, again, is a Masorite construct that destroys the ability to see the fatherhood of the line. Because Arav Kased fathered Shilach, and Shilach, before he fathered Abru, fathered Canaan. Now, Canaan is described in Luke chapter 3 and is a very important person, but there is no discussion of Canaan in the 66 book canon. And the only place you can find the discussion of Canaan and the authenticity of his birth to Shilach is in the book of Yovelim, the book of Jubilees in chapter 8, which describes his birth with particularity and his transgression, which is that he found hieroglyphs, he found petroglyphs on the rocks that was the teaching of the Watchers and how they had used the sun, the moon, and the stars for omens and signs and how to read that. And it reads that he wrote it down and sinned owing to it. But this whole transgression of Canaan is described in the book of Jubilees as extremely important, and it is something that our friend Luke would make sure his name was raised, even though the commentators had no idea from where he got the name. Now, in addition to Arav Kased being a secondary pronunciation, and by the way, the reason Arav Kased is put this way is because he is the father of the Kasdim or the Kasadim. Now, the Kasadim are also going to be known as the Chaldeans, and this heritage is extremely important for understanding Europe because the Kasadim, who are through this line of Arav Kased, now remember, Arav Kased was essentially the primogenitor of Abru. Abru is the correct way to pronounce it, not Aber or Ebro even, but Ebru, which is why Abraham is called a Hebrew, because he is from Ebru, a Hebrew, and the Hebrew people are going to come through Abru. But remember, Abraham had a brother whose name was Nachor, and Nachor had 12 sons before Abraham had one. And those 12 sons became a vitally important group of tribes in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley that would become known as the Chassidim, and the Chassidim. And these Chassidim would then take on the other name known as Chaldeans, and they were the ones who built Babylon. In fact, Babylon was called the excellency of the Chassidim. The Chassidim, being known as the Chaldeans, they would migrate into Europe, being referred to as the Chaldeans, and the Chaldeans would end up being called the Chaldee. The Chaldee became the Chaldee, and the Chaldee became the Keltee, and the Keltee became the Celtic people. And the Celtic people in Central Europe, and again, you're talking about this zone that was called Ashkenaz, a zone that includes, Central Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Czechia, Slovakia, even Austria. This whole area is going to be occupied by Celtic people, the Chassidim. And the Chassidim also may have been the people that occupied the so-called Hittite in the past, a great political clout that suddenly folded. And it appears to have folded and mass migrated. And I think there's a reason for that. We've talked about it before, but the point I'm making is that when you look at Arav Kased, the pronunciation had to be corrected to demonstrate that he is, in fact, the primogenitor of the Ebru. It's not Aber or Eber or Eber, it's Ebru. And so these names have been changed in the Cepher. And we can also see now that when we start talking about Yoktan and his offspring, that his offspring appear to be offspring that are going to be housed all the way through Africa. Hadaram and Utsal and Dikla and Oval and Abimael and Sheva and Ophir and Havilah and Yovav. Very likely describing tribes occupying the southern part of Africa. Okay, let's see what else we have on this. Oh, also, and their dwelling was from Mesha as you go to Cepher, a mountain on the east. Now, again, a mountain on the east, this passage is going to, again, be difficult for us to be certain of its quality. And the reason I say that is because when we look at these words are kind of, well, they're not as easily put as we might think. So, for instance, when you look at Cepher, the name of this place, okay, this means a numbering, okay? So this is what you might call a numbered mountain. Now, you can imagine why a mountain would be called numbered, and it's because of its height, its great height. For instance, when people talk to me about Denali, I explained to them that Denali is 20,320 feet. And we know that Everest is 28,000 and something. But you can see when you talk about large mountains, we often talk about them in terms of how they have been measured. And of course, the word for mountain is Har, like Harman or Harmageddon, the mountain of Megiddo, right? Or sometimes it means a range of hills. And then it says it's on the east, but the word here on the east is Kedem. It comes from Kedema, okay? And it actually means from the ancient places, not necessarily east, but from the ancient places. And so one of the big questions that is raised whenever you see the word Kedem, meaning the ancient places, one of the things you want to ask yourself is, well, wait a minute. What ancient places were there, and how would we know? Were there ancient flood? This is another question too, by the way, and this is a question that's being asked by a number of people. There are some scholars that have written and said, yes, there was more than one survivor of the flood, and yes, there were places that actually survived the flood. So both of those things are interesting. Either way, remember that we're keeping in mind that Genesis is really a book of summaries talking about the whitecaps. We don't get a lot of the details that would be worthy of our time to really see. So these are the families of the sons of Noah after their genetic generation in their nations. And these were the nations divided on the earth. That is to say, the tribes that were divided on the earth after the flood. Okay, so that's going to wrap up our chapter 10.